Samson's tragedy, the arrogance that shattered everything, Jung's archetype of the shadow. We remember Samson as the man of impossible strength, the hero anointed by the divine. But the truth is far quieter and far more dangerous. Israel's giant was undone by something unseen, something he carried within, his shadow. What destroyed him was never Delilah's blade, but his own arrogance, the repressed side of his power, the part he refused to face. This is not merely a tale of biblical betrayal. It is a descent into Carl Jung's analytical psychology, where Samson becomes the perfect case study of a hero who failed his individuation. Samson embodied an untamed logos. His outward strength was a mask for emotional immaturity and a deep dependence he couldn't name. And this unintegrated side, his vanity, his attraction to chaos, became the destructive force of his archetypal shadow. Let us unravel how Samson's failure to integrate the sacred feminine, the Anima, led him to project his own weakness onto Delilah, pushing him toward his fall. You'll see that Samson's tragedy is an eternal warning. True strength lives in wholeness, in the self. And whatever you refuse to confront in your shadow is exactly what rises to destroy you. His story becomes a mirror revealing how your own arrogance, your fears, or your vanity may be quietly sabotaging your potential. And if you feel the call to reclaim your inner voice and begin your journey toward the spiritual authority of the self, don't walk this path alone. Subscribe now to Shadow Work Stories and tap the bell so YouTube can sense the depth of this work and continue guiding you through your own individuation. Leave a like and let's uncover the shadow that ruined the strongest man in the world. The world looked at Samson and saw a miracle of strength, a gift from God. But through the lens of Jungian psychology, something more intricate appears. His strength was his most dazzling persona, a brilliant, rigid facade with a single purpose: to hide the fragility and emotional immaturity he could not or would not face. Samson was, at his core, a man of divine potential locked inside an adolescent psyche. He carried the mission of the Logos, law, order, masculine purpose, yet he used that power to satisfy whims and primal impulses. The strength meant to serve his individuation and free his people became a defense mechanism, shielding him from the real inner work. Jung taught that the shadow is the vault where the ego hides what it cannot accept, traits, instincts, and powers the hero refuses to claim. In Samson, the shadow held 4 lethal elements: arrogance, fear of intimacy, emotional immaturity, and vanity. This archetypal shadow became his psychological Achilles heel. Where he was most powerful in the body, he was weakest in the soul. Whenever a person refuses to integrate a part of the psyche, in Samson's case, Eros and the Anima, that part is projected outward. Samson projected his own disorder and attraction to danger onto the women he loved. His first wife and later Delilah were Philistines, the other, the ritual enemy, the forbidden terrain. The risk of projection. By falling for a Philistine woman, Samson was unconsciously searching for wholeness. He sought outside what he lacked within, the connection to the chaotic, intuitive, sensual dimension he repressed to maintain his image as Nazarite and judge. But projection is a trap. He didn't see the woman as she was. He saw the mirror of his repressed desire and his self-destructive potential. His first choice of partner was his first act of self-sabotage. He ignored the counsel of his parents, the logos of law and order, and obeyed only the blind impulse of his shadow and unregulated desire. This attraction to chaos was his unconscious in motion, forcing him to confront the weakness hiding beneath his strength. Samson's ego was too proud and too fortified to begin shadow work on its own. The shadow had to orchestrate the fall through the lure of fatal attraction. This dance of desire and projection was the rehearsal for the great tragedy. Samson placed himself in danger again and again, as if testing the limits of his luck, or more deeply, seeking the punishment his ego believed it deserved. If the first woman was a mistake, Delilah was destiny. She became the perfect archetypal figure, the embodiment of Samson's negative anima. What was he really trying to master, or to be mastered by, as he exposed himself to emotional danger again and again? And how did this fatal rhythm lead him inevitably to Delilah, the only woman who could touch and expose the shadow he himself could not see? Samson's compulsive pull toward Philistine women was never a cultural preference. It was a psychological command rising from the depths of his unconscious. In Jungian terms, it was the desperate attempt to integrate what his psyche lacked, the anima. The anima is the feminine dimension within the masculine psyche. She is eros, intuition, deep feeling, connection, the wild and indomitable force. Samson as judge and Nazarite, a rigid embodiment of the masculine logos, had pushed these qualities into exile, choosing brute strength and surface-level reason instead. The social dogma of his time, hyper-rational and fearful of the sacred feminine, mistrusted Eros. Samson absorbed this collective shadow. His problem wasn't the object of his desire, it was the projection he cast upon it. He sought outside himself the chaos, passion, and freedom he had condemned to the shadow within. Why the enemy? The Philistine embodied the other, chaos, instinct, nonconformity. By falling in love with a Philistine woman, Samson was falling in love with the hidden part of himself. The attraction to danger, choosing a forbidden woman, was an unconscious act of rebellion. It was his shadow demanding to be seen, challenging the polished persona of the hero. The tension between his Nazarite vow, the promise of the self, and his Philistine desire was his inner conflict breaking out into the world. The desire to be found out. His repetition of the same choice was a test. Deep down, Samson wanted someone to confront him, to disqualify him, to lift the unbearable weight of wholeness from his shoulders. His pattern of choosing women who would predictably betray him was his unconscious crying out for punishment and confrontation. Samson's sexuality was not serving connection, eros, nor devotion, the self. It was a tool for impulsive gratification and a stage upon which he proved his imagined invulnerability. The denial of vulnerability. True love requires the ego to surrender. Samson could only relate to women he could dominate physically or manipulate emotionally, until his manipulation turned back on him. He ran from the vulnerability that genuine intimacy with the Anima would require. Marriage as a trap. His marriage to the first Philistine woman ends in humiliation and violence. He is betrayed not by her nature, but by his ego and by the weakness he projected onto her. This experience didn't teach him. It merely reinforced his belief that the other, the feminine, is treacherous and must be avoided or subdued. The individual psyche refuses to face its own blind spots and instead assigns them to an external group or person. Samson projected chaos, betrayal, and disorder onto the Philistine, other, when in truth he was the most chaotic element in the story. He forced the world to stage the drama of his shadow. The Philistine woman, in this light, was only the mirror he needed to see the guilt and repressed desire buried within his own psyche. With every misguided choice, Samson dug himself deeper, becoming the inverted archetype of the pilgrim, the denial of wisdom, the perpetual drift away from the path of the self. His earlier encounters were rehearsals. Delilah's arrival marked the third and final act, the act of ultimate reckoning. Delilah was not merely another Philistine woman. She was the embodied negative Anima, sharper, subtler, instinctively attuned to the loose threads of Samson's shadow. She did not seduce him through strength, she seduced him through weakness. Why did Samson, the sharpest, strongest man, keep playing the game of secret revelation, lying 3 times, yet each time drifting closer to the truth? Because he was starving for someone who could confront his shadow on his behalf. And Delilah was about to deliver the punishment he had been unconsciously begging for. If Samson's earlier choices were tests set by his shadow, Delilah was the execution. She is not merely a villain in the narrative. She is, through the Jungian lens, the archetype of the negative Anima, the perfect mirror for the fragility the hero feared within himself. Delilah embodied the power of Eros, the very force Samson's rigid, unintegrated logos could not hold. She didn't need strength to conquer the strongest of men. She reached him through his deepest weakness, his hunger for validation, his vanity. Her seduction was simply the external form of Samson's own attraction to chaos and self-destruction. The psychological core of the encounter is not Delilah's betrayal. It is the game Samson chooses to play with her. The compulsive repetition. Delilah asks him 3 times, "Where does your great strength lie?" And 3 times Samson lies. Yet each lie inches closer to the truth. Why would the sharpest, strongest man in Israel do this? Unconscious projection. Trapped between his shadow and his persona of invulnerability, Samson could neither punish himself nor surrender. He needed the punishment to come from outside. By revealing the truth in small doses, he was unconsciously begging Delilah to strip him bare, forcing him toward wholeness through loss. The test of the animus. Samson needed his anima, the intuitive, feeling principle, to appear in a destructive form so he could finally integrate his animus, the principle of reason and discernment. His logos, his mission as judge, was being sabotaged by unregulated eros. The game was his psyche trying to make his inner reason acknowledge what his heart, or rather his shadow, already knew. Samson's tragedy lies in his inability to recognize and honor the sacred feminine, the anima, within himself. Fear of feeling. Had Samson integrated his anima, he would have sensed Delilah's manipulation through intuition and emotional depth. But he had repressed Eros so completely that he had gone blind. The hunger for power. He saw women only as objects of desire or as tools to confirm his masculine persona, never as archetypal partners in the pursuit of wholeness. Thus, He could not form a deep reciprocal bond. Social condemnation. The dogma of his time insisted that a woman could only receive truth through a male intermediary. By internalizing this belief, Samson disqualified the feminine principle within his own psyche, leaving the door open for the negative Anima, Delilah, to act. The fourth and final revelation of the secret is not carelessness. It is Samson surrendering to his own shadow. He allows sleep, the symbol of the unconscious, to overtake him in the lap of his enemy. The strength was never in the hair alone. It was in the Nazirite vow, the living symbol of his bond with the self. By revealing the secret, he was not simply betraying Delilah, he was betraying himself. Delilah's betrayal is nothing more than the external enactment of his internal self-betrayal. She only completed outwardly what he had already done inwardly by breaking his commitment to wholeness and his sacred mission. When Delilah cries, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson," it is not only an external warning, it is the inner cry of his psyche. The danger is here, and it is you. With his hair cut, the strength departs. The fatal blow is not the shearing itself, but the moment Samson awakens and thinks, "I will free myself and shake them off," and cannot. He discovers that the Lord, the psychic energy of the self, has withdrawn. What happens when a hero, blinded by his shadow, loses contact with his own self? What is the psychological meaning of his blindness and imprisonment? And how will the pain of humiliation force Samson into the most brutal shadow work of his life? The moment Samson finally yields and reveals his secret, the Nazirite vow, symbolized by his hair, is not a careless act of love, but the ultimate betrayal of his own self. His power never lived in the strands themselves. It lived in the archetypal bond those strands represented, his connection to wholeness. By breaking the vow, he broke himself. Delilah is the agent, but he is the author of his fall, the one who incarnates the price of his failure. The strength of the Nazirite was the visible expression of his individuation, his journey toward becoming whole. By dismantling that vow, he tore apart the union of opposites, spiritual devotion, logos, and instinctual mastery, eros, that had given him power. His arrogance convinced him he could violate the inner law and still keep the outer blessing. The most devastating blow comes when Samson wakes and thinks, "I will free myself and shake them off as before." He rises confident in his persona, yet the power is gone, and Scripture reveals the psychological tragedy. He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. The withdrawal of the self. The Lord, through the Jungian lens, is the psychic energy flowing from the self, the wholeness within. When Samson violated his vow and surrendered himself entirely to the shadow, vanity, chaotic desire, that energy retreated. His strength vanished because his inner unity collapsed. He lost the spiritual authority that came from within. The arrogance he refused to face blinded him to the seriousness of the game. He treated a divine gift lightly. His fall becomes the natural consequence of his unintegrated shadow. He mistook the strength given to him for the strength he was. But true power never lies in repression, only in wholeness. The Philistines capture him, gouge out his eyes, and drag him away. This act reveals the collective shadow of his enemies. Blindness, By blinding Samson, the Philistines project their own spiritual blindness onto him. They celebrate the triumph of external reason, the logos of warfare, over Israel's spiritual self. They label his weakness, reassuring themselves with the lie. The danger is in him, not in us. The mutilation of the symbol. The loss of his eyes represents the loss of inner vision, the intuitive gnosis, traded away for shallow desire. He is forced to confront the truth that the light he sought outside, negative Anima, had blinded him to the light within. He is stripped of human complexity, reduced to one-dimensional trophy. Samson is taken to Gaza and forced to grind grain in prison. The symbol of the prison. His prison is not just physical, it is the prison of the ego, trapped inside the consequences of unresolved choices. Isolation forces him to internalize his failure. The mill and shadow work. The mill is a profound symbol. Turning it in endless, repetitive circles becomes the harsh soul labor, the compulsory shadow work. This is the moment he must confront his misery, his shattered vanity, his ruined persona. This painful, humiliating labor initiates the individuation he avoided his entire life. The suffering turns him inward, toward the unconscious, where his true power had always lived. Hope in the hollow. Scripture pauses with a subtle but seismic detail. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. This marks the turning point of Samson's inner story. In the depth of prison, inside the void of humiliation, the symbol of the self, the connection to wholeness, begins to regenerate. The morning of the lost projection, his strength, is slowly transmuted into gnosis, direct inner knowing. His labor at the mill becomes his personal Calvary, the slow, grinding acceptance of the shadow he had refused. Stripped of strength, vision, and glory, he is reduced to nothing. And it is precisely in that space of total ego annihilation, where he has nothing left to defend, that redemption becomes possible. What the world saw as condemnation, the self quietly transformed into fuel for final authority. But how would this pain become power? What was he learning about wholeness as he walked in circles in the dark? And how would his death in the enemy's temple reveal to Israel the collective shadow they too carried, forcing Samson to become the archetype of redemption through the shadow? Blind and imprisoned, Samson enters a new and terrifying kind of solitude, not the solitude of judgment, not the condemnation of his people, nor Delilah's betrayal, but the void of certainty. He has lost the object of his projection, his outer strength, and with it the catalyst that once fed his arrogance. This is his dark night of the soul, the threshold every hero must face in the individuation journey. Samson's ego, once inflated, adolescent, desperate for significance, must now shed its final projections. It is a painful unraveling, but it is the only path to truth. The confrontation with doubt. At the core of his soul, there is only silence and the primordial fear. What if my strength, my logos, was just arrogance? What if the wholeness I felt was merely the reflection of my own hunger for meaning? The ultimate abandonment. The void awakens the terror of being abandoned by truth itself. As long as strength lived in his body, Samson could project his inner divinity, the self, onto it. Blindness and loss force him to withdraw that projection. He must now prove that his faith lives in his own inner experience, not in any external gift. The prison and the mill, symbols of humiliation, become the battleground of his deepest war, his own interior. To carry the message of wholeness, he must possess an unshakable certainty, one that can only arise from inner integration. The crisis of the animus. Society, in condemning him, attempted to disqualify his animus, his reason, his discernment, insisting he was nothing but brute impulse. His task now is to validate his intuitive knowing, his gnosis, against the cold logos of apparent defeat. The acceptance of the shadow. He is forced to accept the shadow of being utterly alone, the truth that genuine revelation is often a path for the few. He can no longer return to dogma or to easy power. Surrendering to the void is not defeat, it is the final victory over the fear of not belonging. Grinding the mill becomes an act of purification. Pain dissolves into the fuel of his final authority. Surrender to the flow. By surrendering to the void, Samson stops searching for proof in the past and opens himself to the flow of the future, the path his intuition, now purified, calls him toward. Fear dissolves into the certainty that his mission was never to prove anything, but to embody the truth that transformed him. The restored symbol. The slow return of his hair as he labors is perfect synchronicity, the archetype reassembling itself within the psyche. The body becomes temple. The wholeness he attains becomes his liberation. Life whispers the same command to Samson that it once whispered to Magdalene. Noli me tangere. Do not cling. Do not cling to the old self, the old structure of power or affection. Release the last threads of external validation. Samson frees himself from the need to be affirmed by the world. He transcends personal pain and becomes an archetypal legacy. His body remains captive, but his soul, freed from dependence on outer strength, stands sovereign. Yet his enemies decide to parade him in the temple of Dagon, using him as spectacle for their celebration. He has become his own authority. But where will the redeemed hero carry this wholeness? And how will his final act of sacrifice in the temple of his enemy become the living proof that revelation is personal, intimate, and untouchable by any hierarchy? Samson's tragedy, though deeply personal, was in essence a mirror held up to Israel's collective shadow. Jung teaches that the collective shadow is the storehouse of all the traits, impulses, and failures a society refuses to admit in itself. Israel lived in a cycle of disobedience, repression, and divine correction, and Samson as judge embodied both their divine potential and their hidden wounds. He carried the nation's darkness within his own fate, the betrayal of the vow. Israel repeatedly betrayed its covenant. Samson, breaking his Nazirite vow, incarnated that betrayal on the individual level. The attraction to the mundane. His relentless longing for Philistine women mirrored his Israel's attraction to the paganism and worldly pleasures of its neighbors. The nation feared the wholeness of its spiritual calling and sought comfort in the immediacy of the other. In condemning Samson for his moral failures, Israel was unconsciously condemning the sinful, instinctual part of its own psyche. He became the perfect scapegoat, the individual onto whom the collective shadow was cast. This collective manifestation reaches its peak when Samson is paraded into the temple of Dagon, the Philistine god. He becomes a trophy, mocked openly to feed the collective persona of his enemies. The inverted projection. By ridiculing Samson, the Philistines projected onto him their own desperate need to feel secure and superior. They affirmed themselves with the lie. The danger is not in our repression or our insecurity, the danger is in him. Humiliation became a psychological survival ritual. The triumph of chaos. The celebration in Dagon's temple, a god of fertility and wild nature, a kind of primitive eros, symbolized the temporary triumph of chaos over the sacred logos Samson embodied. For a moment, the pagan world rejoiced in the defeat of sacred order. Yet it is precisely at this point of extreme humiliation and collective assault that Samson's restored self, forged in the silence and suffering of prison, begins to awaken. Under the weight of the collective shadow, he is pushed so deeply into his own unconscious that he finally touches the core of himself. His ego, now utterly destroyed, becomes the catalyst for individuation. He is not merely mourning the loss of strength, he is confronting the colossal lie society used to strip him of his soul. In the temple, the blind hero asks a child to lead him to the pillars that hold the structure. This request is the final act of humility, the full acceptance of physical blindness and total dependence. Yet beneath that humility burns the wholeness he has reclaimed. Humiliation peaks, but in that very moment of despair, he finds the only source of strength that ever truly mattered, the divine within. And then comes the prayer, the one that seals his wholeness and transforms him into the archetypal hero he was always meant to become. A prayer born not from egoic power or childish impulse, but from complete surrender. O Lord, remember me, strengthen me just once more. This is not the Samson of egoic power or childish impulse. This is the Samson who has integrated the shadow, who stands in the unity of logos and eros, who knows that strength is not something he has, but something he channels. His death is not a collapse, it is an initiation. By pulling down the pillars, Samson destroys the physical temple, but psychologically, he collapses the entire structure of projection, scapegoating, and collective fear. He returns Israel's shadow to its rightful owner. His sacrifice becomes the living symbol of a truth Jung insisted on. Redemption is born when the individual dares to confront the shadow that the collective refuses to face. In that final act, Samson becomes what he never managed to be in life, the archetypal redeemer, the hero who dies whole, the man who transforms personal tragedy into an eternal lesson of liberation for his people. Samson's public humiliation in the Temple of Dagon is the ultimate psychological turning point of his journey. Stripped of his persona, the dazzling strength, and crushed by the annihilation of his ego, blindness and bondage, he is forced to release the arrogance that once blinded him and surrender to humility. But this humility is not weakness. It is the radical act of self-acceptance that prepares the ground for the return of the self. In the silence of his prison and the ache of humiliation, he learns what Magdalene also discovered. Wholeness is not outside you. Wholeness is within you. The void of certainty forces him to reclaim the psychic energy he once projected onto his gift. Samson's prayer in the temple is not the cry of a desperate man. It is the action command of someone who has, painfully and completely, finished his shadow work. He asks for strength not to escape, but to fulfill his archetypal destiny. This prayer seals his individuation, the assumption of responsibility. By invoking the divine in that moment, he finally takes full responsibility for his life and mission. He accepts that his fall grew from his shadow, but that his restored strength, the self, must now lead to redemption. Gnosis and the archetype. His grief over losing physical power has been transmuted into gnosis, direct knowing. He understands that the teaching of the Master was never about the story itself, never about the hair or the outward vow, but about the archetype. This was not an isolated miracle. It was the universal psychic pattern. Life arising from death. Light emerging from the shadow. The reunification of opposites. His restored strength is not merely physical power returning. It is the union of logos, purpose, mission, discernment, with eros, intuitive, embodied power, now channeled and under guidance. The hero who once used logos for lust now uses logos for redemption. He becomes a living proof that integration is possible. The slow and silent regrowth of his hair is synchronicity made visible. It is the outer sign of the inner return to the self, forged in suffering. What the world praised as a miracle, Samson recognized as a psychic process. His hair is not the source of strength, it is the unshakable symbol of his renewed wholeness. He no longer needs external proof. The proof is his transformation. The blind hero, forced to look inward, now sees more clearly than the strongest Samson with open eyes. His act of placing himself between the pillars is not suicide. It is an act of spiritual authority. The wholeness he has reached sets him free. He becomes the living testament that the greatest strength a person can hold is the ability to remain whole in a world that demands fragmentation. He becomes the bearer of the only true hope, that any person can find their own wholeness even when the world insists they fracture themselves to fit its expectations. With the self restored and the shadow integrated, Samson becomes an immortal archetype of intuitive knowledge and redemption. He transforms pain into fuel for his mission. He dies, and in dying, frees Israel more deeply than he ever did in life. But what does this final sacrifice, the moment he kills more in death than in life, teach us about the nature of the collective shadow? How does his collapse of the enemy's temple reveal to Israel that true strength lives not in repression or arrogance, but in wholeness itself? Samson's sacrifice in the temple of Dagon is not the climax of his tragedy. It is the moment of his wholeness. It is where the destructive force of his shadow is transmuted into the creative fire of his purpose. His death is not suicide. It is the final, complete act of individuation. The radical act. By embracing the pillars, Samson is not only collapsing a building, he is collapsing the architecture of his old persona, the belief system that once imprisoned him. He chooses death not out of despair, but to fulfill the mission he failed to accomplish in life, proving that the archetype was always stronger than the man. The sacrifice of the ego. The immature, impulsive hero died long before the temple fell. What remains is the purified self, a force no longer used for whim, but for destiny. Samson offers his personal ego so the archetypal self can act, granting freedom to his people, even beyond his final breath. His legacy becomes the archetype of redemption through the shadow. He could only complete his mission by accepting and integrating the very forces that once led to his downfall: his humanity, his blindness, his weakness. Pure integration. Redemption did not come from denying his shadow, desire, vanity, hunger, but from absorbing it, owning it, and redirecting it. In remembering his fall and his humiliation, he channels what was once destructive into a single creative act. He proves that wholeness arrives when a person has the courage to unite their forbidden instinct, shadow, with their discernment and mission, animus, into one unified being. The language of the body. Samson's final act is not theological doctrine, It is the gospel of the body. His life declares that spirit is woven into matter, that falling is often the path to rising. The enemy's lesson. The temple of Dagon, god of earth, fertility, untamed Eros, represents the very force Samson once repressed, feared, and projected outward. By pulling it down, he symbolically destroys his most powerful negative anima projection, freeing himself from the chaotic desire that once ruled him. Samson's story becomes an eternal warning and a permission. Strength and humility. True strength does not live in a gift or in repression, but in humility and wholeness. Samson, in his weakest and most humiliated moment, displayed his greatest power. He proved that the woman who accepts her vulnerability and the man who accepts his weakness is the strongest of all, because they fear neither their shadow nor their light. The final healing. Healing does not come from escape or external validation, but from the bravery of staring into the void, the blindness, and finding the self there. Samson's life became legend because he reached what every soul seeks, the peace born from radical acceptance, every shadow, every light, all crowned by the authority of the self. Samson offered us the legacy of the shadow, the hero who failed only to triumph. He proved that revelation is personal, internal, and untouchable by hierarchy. He became the man who, in dying, finally became whole. And now his story becomes a mirror for yours. What would Samson do with this wholeness? And what will you do with the truth he has left? How will your own shadow work keep your personal arrogance from bringing down your inner temple? Samson's journey ends where every true journey must begin, within us. He leaves us a vital legacy. Strength does not live in the gifts we carry, but in the radical acceptance of who we truly are, in all our flaws and all our light. His story is the mirror that shows how deeply our own society, our modern collective shadow, still tries to fragment us. How often is your own arrogance, your shadow, quietly sabotaging your potential, just as his once did? Samson's greatest danger was never Delilah's betrayal. It was the judgment he cast on himself, the refusal to embrace his own fragile human side. His legacy proves that wholeness, the self, is not a privilege. It is the natural consequence of one courageous act, integrating your shadow. Redemption is never the denial of darkness. It is the gentle, fierce acceptance of it. Samson's final wisdom can be distilled into one psychological command: accept the shadow, not to be punished, but to reclaim the force it protects. Strength is not born from repressing weakness or vanity. It arises from becoming whole. He showed us that true authority belongs to the one who dares to be human, to unite reason with the heart. Samson, the hero who failed in order to triumph, proved that the final healing is spiritual autonomy. You are your own authority. You are your own proof. The wholeness he reached is your own self, waiting to be found. Samson gave us the key to wholeness, but a key unused changes nothing. If Samson's story of arrogance touched the shadow you carry, if you feel the call to reclaim your inner voice and your wholeness, Your soul work, your shadow work must begin now. Subscribe to Shadow Work Stories and tap the bell so you don't miss the next archetypal journey. This channel is not just about stories. It is about transforming pain into wisdom, silence into voice. Leave a like if you believe in the power of wholeness, and click the video on your screen to continue deepening your journey toward the self. And remember, your self is waiting. Wholeness is your destiny.